Imagine winning the greatest war in human history, only to discover that surviving it would become your greatest curse. A king defeats an empire, outsmarts thousands of soldiers, becomes a legend, yet spends the next 20 years running from something that no sword can kill. Not monsters, not storms, not angry gods, his own past. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey isn't just about an ancient hero trying to find his way home. It's the story of a man who may have destroyed an entire civilization and spends the rest of his life asking one terrifying question. Was I ever the hero, or was I always the villain? Stay until the end, because every monster, every storm, and every impossible choice is hiding a truth that completely changes the ending. History remembers wars, but it rarely remembers what happens to the people who survive them. Long before Odysseus became a legend, he was simply a king, a husband, a father, a man who wanted nothing more than to stay home. But history had different plans. One broken promise pulled all of Greece into a war that lasted 10 long years. A war so brutal, its scars would echo for generations. And standing at the center of it all was one man, Odysseus. But here's what makes Nolan's version different. Most stories begin at the beginning. This one doesn't. Instead, we meet Odysseus after everything has already fallen apart. The war is over. His soldiers are gone. His kingdom is far away. And somehow, the greatest strategist in Greece has become a prisoner on an island where time itself feels broken. At first, nothing makes sense. Why is he here? Who trapped him? Why doesn't he simply leave? Those answers are buried inside memories he desperately tries to forget. Because every night, the same nightmare returns. Flames, screaming, the walls of Troy collapsing into fire, children running, soldiers shouting, smoke covering the sky. And somewhere inside that chaos stands Odysseus, watching, silent, unable to escape what he's done. Christopher Nolan immediately tells us something important. This isn't a story about defeating monsters. It's about surviving guilt. Every nightmare is another prison. Every memory, another chain. And before Odysseus can find his way home, he must first survive himself. But what exactly happened in Troy? Why was one single city worth destroying? To understand that, we have to go back to the moment that changed history forever. A prince named Paris made one decision. He stole Helen, the queen of Sparta. One woman, one choice, one mistake. And suddenly, thousands of kings were sailing toward Troy. Not because they wanted war, because years earlier, they had sworn an oath that none of them could break, Odysseus included. The irony? The man who hated unnecessary wars became the very person who would end it. Not with strength, not with numbers, but with an idea. A giant wooden horse. A gift that wasn't really a gift. Inside its hollow body, the greatest warriors in Greece waited, completely silent. Outside, the people of Troy celebrated. They believed the nightmare was finally over. They had no idea they had already carried their own destruction through the city gates. And that single decision would haunt Odysseus for the rest of his life. Because once darkness fell, the horse opened. The soldiers stepped out. The gates unlocked. And before sunrise, one of the greatest cities in history was gone. But destroying Troy was never the end of Odysseus' story. It was only the beginning of his punishment. Next, we enter a journey where every island hides a new nightmare. Every victory demands a sacrifice, and every step toward home takes Odysseus further away from the man he used to be. If Troy was the battle everyone remembers, then the journey home was the war nobody saw. Odysseus had done the impossible. He had defeated an empire. His ships were finally pointed toward home. His crew celebrated. They believed the nightmare was over. They couldn't have been more wrong, because the sea had other plans. Every wave pushed them farther from Ithaca. Every sunrise revealed another unknown island, and every stop would cost them something they could never get back. At first, the danger didn't look like danger. It looked peaceful. An island, fresh water, food, a chance to rest. After years of war, it felt like paradise. But appearances can be the deadliest trap. The people who lived there didn't attack with swords. They attacked the mind. They offered comfort. Forget the war, forget the pain, forget home. Imagine waking up one day, unable to remember your family, your purpose, or even your own name. For some, that sounds like peace. For Odysseus, it was worse than death, because a man who forgets where he's going has already lost the journey. The next island looked empty, silent, almost abandoned, until they found a cave. Inside, food, animals, fire, everything exhausted sailors needed. Then, the entrance closed. A shadow filled the doorway. One giant eye stared into the darkness. The Cyclops. Not simply a monster, a force of nature, stronger than any warrior, large enough to crush men with one hand. Running was impossible. Fighting was suicide. For the first time, Odysseus faced an enemy that intelligence alone couldn't easily defeat. Instead of attacking, Odysseus waited. He observed. He studied. Because sometimes the strongest weapon is patience. When the giant finally lowered his guard, Odysseus struck. One perfect plan, one perfect moment. The Cyclops screamed. The cave erupted into chaos. The survivors escaped, believing they had cheated death itself. But victory has a price. As the ships disappeared into the distance, the blinded giant lifted his voice and called upon his father, Poseidon, Lord of the sea. The oceans grew silent. The wind changed. And from that moment forward, the journey home was no longer just difficult, it became cursed. Storm after storm, wave after wave, every route back to Ithaca disappeared. No matter which direction they sailed, something forced them away. The crew began asking dangerous questions. Was this bad luck, or were the gods punishing them? Slowly, their faith in Odysseus began to crack. A captain can survive monsters, but losing the trust of his own men is a far greater danger. Then, they found another island. This time, they were starving, too weak to keep sailing, too desperate to be careful. A mysterious woman welcomed them inside. Warm food, a safe place to rest. Everything looked perfect, until the screams began. One by one, the soldiers disappeared. Those who entered never came back. The survivors searched desperately, only to discover something impossible. Their friends hadn't been killed. They had been transformed, reduced to animals, stripped of their humanity. It wasn't just magic, it was a terrifying symbol, because war had already done exactly that. It had turned ordinary men into creatures willing to do anything just to survive. Standing before the mysterious woman, Odysseus faced another impossible decision: fight and risk losing everyone, negotiate and trust someone capable of unimaginable power, or sacrifice the few to save the many. He chose a path that would lead him somewhere no living man was ever meant to go. Not another island, not another battlefield, but the kingdom of the dead itself. Because the only person who still knew the way home had already died. And what Odysseus hears in the underworld will convince him that no matter what choice he makes, everyone he loves is doomed. There are places where maps end, places even legends fear to name. And according to ancient myth, one of them was the underworld. Not a prison, not a battlefield, but a place where every regret, every broken promise, and every forgotten soul waits forever. Odysseus had survived wars, storms, and monsters, but now he was about to face the only enemy he could never defeat: the truth.
As the ship drifted into complete darkness, Giannis, and the ocean became unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, no sound, only silence. His crew stopped speaking. Even the bravest warriors could feel something watching them, not with anger, but with expectation. Ancient legends claimed the dead never truly leave. They simply wait for the living to remember them. And tonight, Odysseus had come looking for answers. Instead, the past came looking for him. The first voices weren't monsters. They were familiar soldiers, friends, men who had trusted him, men who had followed his orders into battles they never returned from. They didn't accuse him with swords. They didn't seek revenge. They asked something much more painful. Was it worth it? Every victory had demanded a sacrifice. Every brilliant strategy had left another family broken. For years, Odysseus had convinced himself that he had no choice. But standing among the dead, that certainty began to disappear. Perhaps winning the war had cost far more than anyone realized. Deep within the darkness, one figure remained perfectly calm, an old prophet, blind, yet able to see farther than anyone alive. He didn't greet Odysseus. He didn't comfort him. Instead, he offered something far more terrifying: the future. But it wasn't the future Odysseus wanted. It was the future he couldn't escape. The prophet spoke quietly. Soon, your ship will reach a place where every path ends in tragedy. Choose one direction, and 6 of your men will die. Choose the other, and everyone dies. No clever plan, no hidden escape, no perfect strategy. For the first time in his life, Odysseus faced a problem. Again, that intelligence couldn't solve. Some battles that cannot be won, only survive. Imagine carrying that knowledge. Imagine standing before your crew, knowing some of them will never see another sunrise. Would you tell them? Or would you remain silent, hoping ignorance might spare them fear? That is the burden of leadership. People believe leaders carry power. The truth, they carry consequences. Every decision saves someone and sacrifices someone else. Odysseus finally understood why kings grow old long before their time. When they finally reached the cursed waters, the prophecy unfolded exactly as promised. The sea exploded into chaos, massive waves, jagged cliffs, screams disappearing into darkness. One by one, his companions vanished. The survivors looked toward Odysseus, not with trust, but with doubt. For years, they had followed the greatest strategist in Greece. Now they saw only a man who could not protect them. That realization hurt more than any monster ever could. The greatest curse was never Poseidon. It wasn't the sea. It wasn't fate. It was guilt. Because once a leader begins questioning himself, every decision becomes heavier. Every loss becomes personal. Every face becomes impossible to forget. And as hope slowly disappeared, Odysseus made one final attempt to save the people who still believed in him. He had no idea that the next mistake would leave him completely alone, stranded, broken, haunted by the dead. The legendary king had lost everything: his army, his friends, his certainty. But the hardest part of the journey still hadn't begun, because after 20 years away, Odysseus would finally see his homeland again. The question was, would Ithaca still recognize its king, or had the war created a completely different man? Slow, emotional, hopeful, yet tense. After 20 years and the horizon finally changed, no monsters, no storms, no endless ocean, just one small island, the place Odysseus had dreamed about every single day. Ithaca, home. Pause. But sometimes coming home is harder than surviving the journey, because while he had been fighting for 20 years, time had never stopped. For the people waiting for him, the palace still stood. The mountains hadn't moved. The sea still crashed against the shore. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow nothing felt the same. His son was no longer a child. His wife had spent 2 decades refusing to believe he was dead. And inside his own palace, strangers now laughed, ate his food, and planned to steal everything he had built. Not through war, but through patience. They believed one thing: Odysseus would never return. And honestly, so who could blame him? 20 years is long enough to turn hope into memory. Most heroes would have marched straight through the palace doors, declaring victory. Odysseus didn't, because real wisdom comes from observation. Instead of revealing himself, he disguised himself as an old beggar, dirty clothes, a tired face, a broke
traveler, asking for nothing more than kindness. It was the perfect test, because power never reveals character. Power reveals nothing, but how people treat someone who has absolutely nothing reveals everything. And what Odysseus witnessed broke his heart. The men inside his palace mocked him, insulted him, humiliated him. Some even laughed while eating the food that belonged to his family. Only a handful still remembered what honor looked like. And then his wife announced one final challenge. Whoever could string the legendary bow and fire an arrow through a line of axes would become the next king. One after another, the strongest men in Greece failed. Some couldn't even bend the bow. Others gave up completely. The room filled with silence, until the old beggar stepped forward. With calm hands, he lifted the bow. No struggle, no hesitation. The weapon remembered its true owner. One smooth movement, the string tightened, the arrow flew, straight through every target. Perfect. The room froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the beggar looked into their eyes and revealed the truth. I am Odysseus. The king had finally come home. The battle that followed was fast, brutal, merciless. Years of anger exploded in a matter of minutes. When the dust settled, the palace was silent once again. The kingdom had been reclaimed. The enemy was gone. So, this should have been the happy ending, right? Not exactly. Because some victories arrive too late. Christopher Nolan's ending isn't asking whether Odysseus won. It's asking what victory actually cost. Yes, he defeated Troy. Yes, he survived monsters. Yes, he reclaimed his kingdom. But every victory left another scar. The greatest prison was never Calypso's island. It was never Poseidon's storms. It wasn't even the underworld. It was the memory of the people who never came home. every face, every decision, every life taken because of one strategy that changed history forever. Perhaps the gods were never chasing Odysseus. Perhaps his conscience was. In the end, the Odyssey isn't really about ancient Greece. It isn't even about mythology. It's about every person who keeps moving forward while carrying the weight of yesterday. Because sometimes the longest journey isn't across an ocean. It's the distance between guilt and forgiveness. Odysseus teaches us something timeless. Strength can win battles. Intelligence can defeat enemies. But only wisdom can heal a broken soul. And maybe the true meaning of home was never a place. It was the moment he finally accepted the man he had become. If Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey proves one thing, it's that the greatest monsters aren't always waiting in dark caves or beneath violent seas. Sometimes they're the memories we carry inside ourselves. And maybe that's why, thousands of years after it was first told, the Odyssey still feels like our own story. Because every one of us is trying to find our way home. Fade out.